Goodbye voting rights. Let's play hardball. Good evening. I'm Chris Matthews up in New York. Let me start tonight with this. A happy day for Reince Priebus. That's what today was. Anyway, you look at it. Today, the United States Supreme Court lopped off the head of the Voting Rights Act that removed a key weapon used to stop states from suppressing African Americans and other voters they don't like showing up at the polls. What a joy this must be to the Republican National Headquarters where Reince Priebus holds sway. It opens the door for far more voter suppression by Republican-dominated state legislatures. Catch this. In the year 2011, just 1 year preparing for the 2012 presidential election, 41 states, that's all but 9, engaged in some form of restriction on voting. Think of what Reince Priebus and his gang of voter suppressionists will be able to do now that the Voting Rights Act isn't in their way. Joining me right now to talk about it, Ryan Haygood of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, and civil rights leader Julian Bond, former chair of the NAACP. Mr. Bond, I want to start with you. I don't know what you make of it, but this seems to be a 5-4 decision by a Republican-dominated Supreme Court that didn't like the Voting Rights Act, period, and got rid of its teeth and its head and its eyes.
It's exactly that. This is Justice Roberts' dream. He's been trying to do this since he was in the Reagan Justice Department as a younger lawyer, and it's finally made his dream come true. He's been able to maneuver the Supreme Court so that they've gutted the Voting Rights Act, just as you said, made it impossible to block attempts to suppress black voting. This is a good deal for the Republicans. It's an awful deal for the United States.
Well, let me bring in Ryan Haywood of the NAACP. You're the expert on this. It seems to me if you can't have a map that tells you which states that have to get pre-agreement on making change their voting rules, you don't have a weapon here.
That's right, Chris. Thanks for having me on the show. Today's decision really is a disgraceful one. It's a significant departure, Chris, from the Supreme Court's own precedent over 4 decades upholding the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act. And what it does, very concretely, Chris, is that it lays bare, it lays vulnerable millions of voters of color in those places previously covered by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. They're now open to a host of attacks in those jurisdictions that over time have been most relentless, most adaptive, and most intense in their forms of voter discrimination. So, for example, the Supreme Court issued its opinion this morning around 10:30. Already today, there are news reports from the state of Texas which are saying now that Texas will implement its photo ID measure. You'll remember that Texas's photo ID measure was blocked under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act and was regarded as one of the most discriminatory voting proposals in the country at the time.
You know, I just want to get this in perspective, and I couldn't have a better person here than Julian Bond. If you think about just the way America has changed, back in 1964, the all-white delegation to the United States Senate from these southern states, for example, Texas, South Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, Virginia, they're all white guys, basically. They all voted against the Civil Rights Bill, knowing that was good politics for them, to deny the chance of a black person, man or woman, to walk into a restaurant, go to a men's room or a ladies' room at a gas station. To vote against all those rights was in their political interest because no blacks were allowed to vote. This is what the Civil Rights Act changed, what the Voting Rights Act particularly changed in '65. Talk about the history of how everything was changed, because when the blacks were guaranteed the federal government was on their side and making sure they had a right to vote, everything changed.
You know, we owe all this to Lyndon Johnson, who may have been condemned for his activities in the Vietnam War, but in civil rights, he was #1. He was the president who led this through the Congress. He had the skills and the ability to do it. He helped pass the Civil Rights Act and then the Voting Rights Act. He changed America. He made it into a different country. And in the years from then until now, we've lived under these laws that have protected people if they wanted to vote. Now these protections just washed away in an instant by the Roberts Court. This horrible, horrible day for America. It's an awful, awful day, and it's going to take an enormous effort by a lot of people, black, white, of all races and colors, of all political persuasions, everybody who believes in justice and fair play, to set this right again.
And by the way, there was Everett Dirksen. It's hard to remember, Mr. Haygood, that there were Republicans like him back in the 60s who voted not only for the Civil Rights Bill, for the Voting Rights Act as leaders. Anyway, let me ask you about this. The real world we live in, it takes 60 votes to get anything through the U.S. Senate. And some states are going to get hurt, they'll think it that way, under a new voting rights map. So you just assume that the states that are targeted by a new map aren't going to vote for it. Just think about that. And then you got to figure out you got to get 60 of the other remaining senators to vote for some new map. I know people like to be optimistic. Maybe Eric Holder, the AG, is optimistic. But how can any reasonable person assume that the way the Congress is set up today, they're going to actually come up with a new set of states, a map of states, where there's a need to have prior review of any voter change?
And so, Chris, I think here is where there's a silver lining in what is an otherwise disgraceful moment. And that is that Congress, I think, has an opportunity to take what has happened to them and to this country, to Mr. Bond's point more broadly, personally. In 2006, the U.S. Senate voted 98-0 in support of reauthorizing the Voting Rights Act. The U.S. House voted 390 to 33. Overwhelmingly, there was bipartisan support for reauthorizing the Voting Rights Act. What the court did today was said that there were 98 senators and 390 members of the House who did something irrational, and so they struck what they did as unconstitutional. I think this is a moment for the United States Congress to test it, for the U.S. Congress to test its heart, to look inside and look at its mettle and its spirit and determine whether it's now willing to stand in the gap to bridge the gulf that the Supreme Court's decision has created.
Do you believe in Santa Claus?
I don't believe in Santa Claus, but I do believe that Congress has an opportunity to receive today's ruling as a challenge and to respond to it.
Let me go back to Julian, and then I'll be back to you in a minute for another thought on this. How do you get senators and congressmen? We have a Republican House, conservative House, in fact, archly conservative in many ways. How do you get that House and a Senate that requires 60 votes, particularly to target maybe another 10 states, to now designate afresh states that are guilty of voting rights suppression, therefore have to have the responsibility to get prior review for any change in their law? How do you get that through this Congress? I just don't think that it squares with this Congress, its willingness to go out and name these states.
It doesn't seem that way, but I've always been an optimist. I've always believed the best thing could happen, and I think if you appeal to people's better natures, they will respond. Now, often they don't, often they behave in the worst kind of way, but I think you have to assume that they'll do the right thing, and you have to knock on their doors, you have to ask them about it, you have to tell them you're going to turn out a lot of voters, you're going to make sure that they don't get reelected if they don't do this. You have to put the fear of God and the fear of the electorate in them, and I think there are enough Americans who believe strongly about this, people of all races and kinds, who will get this done.
What about the Republican Party today? I'm not talking about it historically. It's not always been bad in any sense. But right now, led by Reince Priebus, and the fact that we've got 41 states now that have tried in the last cycle, the last electoral cycle in 2011, right before the 2012 election, all tried to change their laws to make it harder for blacks to vote. Now, what makes you think that that same crowd of people, a political crowd, that party led by Reince Priebus, who supports all this stuff, a party intent on voter suppression of minorities and young people, will change its mind and vote to target new states for a voting rights procedure? Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond.
I say you have to have them ask themselves, do we want to see a Republican president elected in the next decade or so? Do we want 20 years from now there to be a Republican president of the United States? If we do, we've got to change our behavior. We've got to be attractive to black voters. We've got to be attractive to Hispanic voters. And the way we're behaving now, attractive to either one. In fact, we're repulsive to both of them.
Ryan,
so if we want to see a Republican president, we've got to do something different.
But Ryan, that has not been the pattern of state legislatures across this country, and dozens of them from states that aren't even under voter rights inquiry or inspection, like Pennsylvania, where they were trying to change the law and make it very hard, all kinds of documentation to show up at a voting booth. Or down in Florida, where Bill Clinton, the former president, went after them when they said no more Sunday voting, knowing that African Americans like to go from church to voting prior to election day. And also because you've got these very intensely crowded African American areas in big cities like Philadelphia, where the voting lines are so long. We've got new numbers now, 20 minutes to vote if you're an African American. It takes so much longer that people want to be able to vote earlier. They want these options. And now these state legislatures run by Republicans say, we don't want you to have these options because we don't want you to vote.
But I think here's where...
Isn't this all true, what I'm saying?
Well, I think this is where Mr. Bond's point is really salient. I mean, the voter suppression tactics that we saw proliferate in the last several years were wildly unpopular among the American populace. Americans don't like when they see that voter restrictions are proliferating. They don't like when the democracy is being contracted. Americans are fans of expanding their electorate, of expanding democracy. And to Mr. Bond's point, both parties, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, have a real challenge ahead of them in making themselves relevant to the American populace. A The 2010 census told us that by 2042, America will be a majority-minority nation.
Yeah.
And there's an opportunity for both parties and for Congress to recognize the way that America's landscape is changing, the way the burgeoning political power is happening, and for there to be a response. Today's response is that Congress has to step in the gap that was opened up by the Supreme Court by this most
here's the problem with
unfortunate
your
opinion.
optimism here. The problem is your optimism. And you start here. You can't have a better turnout than you had for President Obama in the last election, 2012. Some people have been disillusioned since, but certainly the turnout was unbelievable. And a lot of it was spurred by anger, as you say, and what they saw as the effort by conservative white people basically to screw them out of voting. So everybody showed up and said, look, we're going to show those people playing games up in Harrisburg and Tallahassee. We're going to show them we can show up at the voting booths, okay? How can they do more than they already did? And look what's happened to them now.
But Chris, here you see is on one aspect of America's burgeoning electorate. Latinos, Asian Americans, those are new sources of political power that are just now coming into their own. Look at Texas, the expansive growth of Latinos in Texas.
I think that's a state that's going to go purple soon. I agree with you there.
And so there are meaningful opportunities, and this is not just blind optimism. The reality is that we're thinking about the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington and what that meant, how that was a watershed moment, and how that came on the heels of a history of exclusion in this country, and then followed by an opportunity to expand our democracy. We're looking at that again now, Chris, and there's an opportunity for Congress to step in the gap and for us to express outrage as well.
Ryan, let's have lunch someday, because you make me more optimistic than I normally am. But thank you so much for your optimism. You don't believe in Santa Claus, but you're optimistic. Mr. Julian Bond, it's an honor to have you on this show. Please come back. It's great to have your historic perspective and your great mind. Thanks for coming on. Coming up, the so-called IRS